students at some level or in your departments. What a great perspective that you can bring to our campus. And really thank you for the positive ways in which you do that. I also would just say, I was a UC faculty member before I came here. I recently was so relieved that I passed muster and got an appointment in the chemistry department. So I am now a UCSC faculty member. And so now my career aspiration then is to be one of the Emeriti. So maybe at some point in the future, I will join your ranks in earnest. But so great to see you today. The university's on a really terrific trajectory. We're doing amazing things to help with student success. Our recent election to the AAU really built on the great work of faculty over many, many years that led the university to that point. You could not escape knowing that we right now have some challenges with our graduate students. I just wanted to speak to that for a minute, and by saying that housing in Santa Cruz is at a crisis point, and it affects really every aspect of our university, and that we have great empathy for the graduate students and would like to be in a position to try and help them. The action that they've taken to have a strike outside their union contract makes that really challenging, and that I hope that we can get things resolved quickly, not just for our graduate students, but for our very special and often vulnerable undergraduate students who need to get their grades. So if you have the opportunity to help in persuading people to think in a little bit more open mind about this situation and how we can address it, I think that would be a great thing. And I would also just encourage you, if you have questions, to reach out. I'm always open by email especially, but in other ways to communicate with people about any aspect of the university. We're on a pathway to even greater excellence. And to get there, it's not a chancellor that can do that. It's all the people of the university. It's our great faculty, including you, our students and our staff, all together help us get to even greater milestones. So wish you a great program. I wish I could stay, but it is nice to see you here today, and just to let you know that you're often in my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, so I wanted to make just one other announcement before we get to our speaker, and that is that one of our activities is that twice a year we have a special emeritus lecture. And this year, Bernie LeBeouf gave the lecture in the fall, great talk from Bernie. And coming up will be a talk from Paul Lubeck on politics of Africa, a region that Paul has been much involved in over the years. So we recently selected our two speakers for next year, and I'd like to tell you that they both accepted. So in the fall, we will have Physics Professor Emeritus Joel Premack as our speaker. Joel has won some major award in particle physics recently. And in the spring, our speaker from the arts will be Ruth Solomon. And in talking to Ruth about it, she said that she'd really like to hear from you what you would like to hear from her. Ruth is involved in everything from dance to physical therapy, so she has a broad range of involvements and actually seriously interested in hearing what you would think she might talk about. So bump into Ruth later on.
Please.
Okay, so today's speaker is Professor Ben Storm from the psychology department. You know, we had, I think, a record sign-up for this meeting, I said today, and maybe it was something about the topic, remembering, memory, forgetting, etc. Oh, before I do that, I almost forgot. Virginia actually has two things that she wanted to say. Virginia, would you come now?
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am the Senior Director of Plan Giving for UC Santa Cruz, and I wanted to tell you about the Secure Act that was passed at the very end of December. It now applies to people who have individual retirement accounts. The age required to withdraw minimum distributions has increased from 70 and a half to 72. However, the age to utilize the IRA rollover program, where you make gifts directly to charities, remains at 70 and a half. I'm co-hosting with the Community Foundation of Santa Cruz County an estate and legacy planning seminar on February 12th at 9:30 a.m. at Peace United Church. If you want to know more about that act, or if you just want a refresher on estate and legacy planning, I would encourage you to register. Thank you. And I'm going to leave flyers in the back. I'm also leaving flyers for our travel program, in case anyone's interested. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so about Ben Storm. So Ben is a product of the University of California. Were you born in California, Ben?
I was.
He was, okay. He got his undergraduate degree at UC Santa Barbara, and then a PhD at UCLA, and then postdoctoral work at the University of Illinois, or you were off at the university?
First professor.
Oh, a professorship at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Okay, but we were able to get him to come to Santa Cruz in 2012, I believe, where he has been working in the psychology department. Now, the interest in this topic is testified to by the fact that Ben's work has been discussed not only in places like Science and Nature, but better, the New York Times had a big story on the question of whether it's good or not, whether or not you can't remember where you parked your car. So Ben's going to tell us what this is all about. Ben.
I am fully wired up to this thing, so I cannot move around like I normally do. Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here at this event. I'm really excited to be here. I've never given a talk quite like this before, and so when I was invited, I also struggled with trying to decide what to talk about. Over the years, am I not talking loud enough? Over the years, I've done many different types of research, and I've kind of have this problem where I get interested in everything, and so I'll end up trying to study too many things, which I always bring back, and I think they all get at a common core, a common concept, this idea that forgetting is fundamental to the process of remembering and thinking and behaving. And so I think it all connects, but it means that trying to decide what to talk about can be a little frustrating. But here, what I decided to talk about here is one of my newer areas of research. So I'll tell you a little bit in one slide about all the things that I have studied and what my lab focuses on, just to give you a little bit of context. But then I thought this would be a fun topic, remembering and forgetting in the digital age. Because it's so new, and I'm hoping that this can be a discussion, feel free to interrupt with thoughts and questions as to try to get some feedback from you all about where to take this research into the future. Because it is still somewhat ill-formed in that we don't really know what the most important questions to ask are yet. All right. So here's a quick overview of the things I study. Hopefully that can be seen. I'll just really briefly, I study how retrieval is an adaptive process that modifies and updates memory. We often think of memory as functioning like a computer. It doesn't. It's very different in the sense that when you access a memory on a computer, you open the file, you close it, it's there, you haven't changed it. Whenever you actually retrieve a memory, you fundamentally alter it. You make it so it's going to be more accessible in the future. You make other information less accessible, a phenomenon called retrieval-induced forgetting. And you actually reconsolidate the memory. You change it. You update it in ways to fit your new beliefs and your new contexts. So your memories are never the same every time you remember them. They're constantly in this state of flux. So I'm interested in studying that process about how using memory changes and shapes memory. I'm also interested in applying the principles of cognitive psychology to enhance education. So how can we optimize schedules of learning and test reviews and various other conditions to maximize how people learn? And how can we understand people's metacognitive beliefs about learning? There's often a mismatch in that students love to do things that aren't effective for learning, but don't understand why they're not effective for learning, and they ignore things that are useful. And teachers fall victim to this as well. And so I try to study these dynamics, hopefully to improve things in the future. And then I'm also interested in the cognitive mechanisms underlying creativity. You might think creativity, that's not memory. Well, to me, everything is memory, and especially creativity. When you think of memory, you think that's remembering the past. But memory was actually designed to inform behavior. It's designed to allow you to interact with people you remember and you know, and make decisions, and to imagine the future, and to solve problems, and to think of new ideas. And so our memory is underlying all of those processes. So I see creativity as a fundamental function of memory. And so I study ways in which we're able to overcome fixation in memory to solve new problems, and also to imagine future as well. So that's sort of like a context of my lab and what I'm interested in. I'll also give credit to my PhD advisors, Bob and Elizabeth Bjork, and I took this idea, and this core idea, and it's in a lot of my work, that there is this, that memory is characterized by a remarkable symbiosis of forgetting, learning, and remembering, that you can't separate them. You can't study one without the other two, and that what I'm really interested in is how all of these interact. How does forgetting not undo learning, but facilitate new learning? How does forgetting occur as a result of remembering? And how does learning prompt additional learning and affect the way in which we remember and forget? And so I really try to understand how all of these processes interact. Today, though, I'm going to be talking about memory and technology, and specifically how memory might be changing as technology becomes an increasingly important part of our lives. It's kind of funny. When you go to most memory labs, this is how it works. Participants come to the door, they knock, and you say, okay, come on in. Be sure to turn off your phone. You're not allowed to access it. They sit you in front of a computer and they have you do a task, or they give you some tasks to do. And it kind of dawned on me that's sort of funny, right? Because most undergrads are with their phone 99% of the day. Yet we are telling them to do a memory experiment and trying to understand how their memory works in the absence of the thing that they always have. So what are we seeking to understand? Are we trying to understand how people actually think and remember? In which case, it's silly to only study them in the absence of the technology that they're attached to. You can make an argument that it's like telling them to cut off a part of their brain before coming into the experiment. Maybe not that extreme, but we're getting there. Because if you buy into some of these arguments of extended mind, and Clark and Chalmers have argued, for example, that it is, that our phones, the internet, it's part of us. It's part of who we are. It holds many of our memories, much of our semantic knowledge, the information we're going to use when we make decisions. And so in some ways, it is a part of us, if not connected via the typical neural pathways that we think of the organic mind. And so with that, and the inspiration of students who were constantly being interested in this idea, I decided to try to investigate it more thoroughly. And that really, if I want to understand how people store, access, and use knowledge, I need to understand how they're doing this in the context of technology. Yeah?
So since many of us grew up without the internet, perhaps we developed a better memory. I don't know. Have you examined that as an issue?
Two answers. Probably yes. But better is always a difficult word. Like, it might be better in some ways, but not in other ways. And so it's a nuanced argument. But over the years, I think, I'm going to get back to this in about 3 slides, I think you could make the argument that we are not quite able to do the things we used to be able to do because of it. And I would just like to give credit to 2 of my PhD students. Almost all the work I'm going to talk about here was really spearheaded by them, so they deserve a lot of credit, Julia and Sean. So here's a quote by a philosopher. This discovery will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls because they will not use their memories. They will trust to the external and not remember of themselves. They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. I'm guessing many of you will know who this is, but when I read this to my undergrads, they think it's some 21st century philosophy professor talking about the internet. Who is this? This is Socrates 2,400 years ago. It's nothing new. I mean, we've been struggling with this problem for 2,400 years. And this, what was Socrates referring to? The written word. Socrates did not want to write things down because to write was to offload into, you wouldn't remember, you wouldn't know, you wouldn't gain expertise the same way. We have no way of doing this experiment. It would be great if we could do a time travel machine, go back and compare current humans with then and see in what ways they differ. And certainly there were certain skills and memory skills that individuals back then had that we probably don't. This ability to spin a narrative, to tell a story, to have an attention span over 15 seconds. Like, all of these things are changing. At the same time, maybe they couldn't handle the massive amounts of information that we deal with now, and find ways of interacting with external resources to constantly produce and new things. Now, whether we're actually good at that, I don't know. I don't think we know yet as researchers, as a discipline, what the full range of costs and benefits really are. I also tend to show this, you've got old technologies like the Word, books, and libraries. I mean, these are pretty established. Most people agree that they're a good thing for human cognition. And it's alarming kind of when you think about the things that are reshaping current life, how recent they are. Google did not exist prior to 1998. Yes, I'm relatively young, but I did not know what it was like to be able to access information online as a kid growing up. And now kids don't know what it's not like to do that. It's a different way of thinking. Or Wikipedia, Facebook, the iPhone. The smartphones are so recent. And yet now we all have access to so much information. Alexa, I probably should add Alexa up there in these apps where you're sitting in your living room and you have a thought. You want to have information. You just ask. And somehow the algorithm gives you, most of the time, the answer you're looking for. The change is rapid. And what I'm going to argue, and so people have said, is this anything different? Do we really need to pay attention to this? Because we've been talking about this for 2,400 years. It's the same old, same old. I would argue that it is different in the sense that the internet's breadth, depth, and availability is unparalleled. You can carry books around. You can access them in libraries, but it's slow. You still have to have a lot of internal knowledge to use that information. Whereas you don't have to as much with the internet, where you can find almost anything, and the depth is greater than almost any expert. The breadth, the amount of experts available, and the sheer availability of it always being with you is unparalleled. So in this idea of cognitive offloading, it seems possible that a lot of how we think and how we remember is being offloaded to external devices in a way that could fundamentally change cognition. If not by affecting the way our internal memory works, at least by how we actually use our memory in everyday real environments. Okay, that's my preamble. Now, most memory researchers didn't really think or care about this at all for a long time, at least if you read the published literature. And then about 8 years ago, Betsy Sparrow and Dan Wegner's lab published a paper that was called the Google Effect. This paper was extremely well read. It was in the New York Times for sure talked about, and all the other news outlets. And I'll say at the outfront that some of the effects might not be that reliable, but the ideas are. The ideas have changed the way memory researchers have thought about these topics, and it's really inspired a lot of people to start investigating them. And the work was based on the idea that what we do is we form transactive memory systems, that we don't just have the memory in the head, but that we think and we remember with others. This has been traditionally studied in the context of pairs or groups of individuals. So you have a partner, and you know your partner remembers all your relatives' names, so you don't have to remember them, or when the birthdays are, or if you know that they will always be able to remember the instructions for how to fix the cable box, so you don't have to mess with that. This is what this was studied, and so they would bring pairs of people, and if they knew each other, they were able to efficiently divide up the demands of a memory task and outperform what they would have if they were alone in combination. And this was a great area of work. People studied it for decades. And then the other thing is, often with transactive memory systems, what's important is to remember where information is, not what the information is. So you have to know who to ask and where to go to find it, as opposed to the information itself. The internet has been argued, and was argued by Sparrow, Liu, and Wagner, to be a particularly powerful transactive memory partner. That in the sense that it's always there, and it has so much information that it's becoming functionally a transactive memory partner in a way that we've never had before. And some people even argued that it has altered the nature of relationships we have with our partners and other people, because we don't need to rely on others in the same way that we used to. So the way Sparrow et al. Studied this is they put participants in the lab, and they sat them down at a desk, and they had them read sentences. And the sentences had random obscure facts. Things like an ostrich's eye is bigger than its brain. The Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry over Texas in February 2003. These are two examples, and I think there were like 20 or 30 of them. For half of the participants in one study, they were asked to press spacebar to save what you typed. And they were led to believe that if you saved it, you would have access to that information later on. But if you hit the spacebar, the other half of the subjects were told if you hit spacebar, it's going to erase what you just read, with the idea that if you think it's erased, you're going to have to remember it yourself. And when they subsequently gave people a surprise memory test, they found that people who were instructed to erase the sentences remembered them better than people who were told to save them, with the idea that saving was causing it's not really forgetting, the lack of probably encoding, the lack of learning this information, because you think it's always just going to be available on the computer.
Was this a recall test that they were tested with, not
Yeah.
recognition?
So they did it both ways, and they found this effect with both recall and recognition, which is important, right? Because if it's recognition, it means it's really not being learned the same way. Now, They also, in subsequent work, tried to test whether people remembered whether they had saved or erased it, and what. Sometimes they. And sometimes they had them put them in specific files like facts and non-interesting. I forget what the files were. They were kind of silly, but there were like 6 different files. And what they found is that people, in general, were pretty good at remembering where they saved it, even if they didn't remember what the information was. And so this goes with this transactive memory explanation. Another thing they showed in this paper was that people are primed to think of the internet when they experience a lack of knowing. The way they did this is they presented participants either a bunch of easy questions or a bunch of hard questions. This is not in presenter view, so I can't read them to you. I'll try to make them up. The easy questions were like, are dinosaurs extinct? Things like that. And the hard questions were, did Benjamin Franklin give piano lessons? That was a real one. I didn't make that one up. And the idea was, I don't know what the answer is. How many of you are going to look that up before this talk is over? Don't tell me. I don't want to know. But what they found is that if you gave people a bunch of these difficult questions, that changed the way you would subsequently do this next task. So in a separate phase, they were shown words and asked to name the colors as quickly as possible. So in the study of psychology, this is known as a Stroop task. It's very popular. Here, your task is not to say Yahoo or Google or Nike or Target. It's simply to name the color. So you say red, blue, for example. And what research has shown is that you are slower to respond to words that are activated. If it's implicitly activated in your mind, you're going to be slower to respond to it. And if you got all those hard questions, then you were primed with words like Google and Yahoo. You're now slower to name the color because those words are activated. You're actually thinking about Yahoo and Google after experiencing the hard trivia questions, whereas the easy ones you're not. So the idea is that we're primed increasingly to think of these internet words, to the internet in general, when experiencing a lack of knowing. My first foray into this whole field came just a few years ago with an undergrad here at the time who really wanted to do a follow-up on that project. And I thought it was an interesting effect. We had this forgetting effect caused by saving, right? So saving, this cognitive offloading effect. But I also made the argument that if this is doing what we think it's doing, if we're really offloading, there should be a benefit to it. In the sense that if you don't have to remember information yourself, that should free up resources to remember something else or to think about something else. So we designed it looks complicated with this figure, but it's pretty simple paradigm to just test that idea. Participants were given a PDF that contained a list of words. And then they were told on some trials to save that file to the computer or to not save. They got the list of words on a flash drive and they either saved it to their computer or they were told, close it and it's gone. After that, they were asked to open a second PDF file, PDF-B, that also contained a list of words. There was a brief delay where they did some distractor task and then they were tested on this file here. This is the one we mostly care about, this test B. This is what we were most interested in. And then just to stay honest, we allowed them to restudy that file A if they had saved it, and of course they don't get to restudy it if they didn't save it here. This is just to show them that saving is actually doing something. And then they were tested on A. And what we found is that first of all, if you had got the chance to save file A and use it at test, you did really well on file A because it was available to you. But you also did better on file B. The idea here is that because you saved file A, because you kept it in mind, because you didn't have to keep it in mind, because you had offloaded that to the computer, you were able to focus more of your memory resources towards encoding file B than you would have otherwise, and therefore you outperform participants who had to continue to hold on to that file A while engaging in this file B task. So pretty straightforward, but I think this would generalize to many other circumstances. Say if you're trying to remember that you have to do something when you're meeting and talking to someone, having that on your mind is going to affect what you remember about them, whether you remember their name, what you're talking to them about. Whereas if you can offload that before having that conversation, you probably are going to encode quite a bit more.
Did the participants know that they were going to have a test on A later?
Yes, this was all laid out to them so they knew exactly everything that was going to happen, and then we went through iterations of this. Yeah. In a subsequent study, we showed that there is a boundary condition, and it's very important, though. If people do not trust the save mechanism, then you don't get this benefit. So what we did is on one trial, we went ahead and they tried to open up a file that they had saved, and it says there was an error opening this file, it's been corrupted, and the RA just says, tough luck, go ahead, do your best. Now there is no benefit for file A, and there's no benefit for file B. So that benefit is you have to really rely on the technology. If you don't, then you don't see this saving enhanced memory effect. Another way in which you could study cognitive offloading in a transactive memory systems is with cameras. This is also rapidly changing with smartphones. Did you know that over, I think, like 2 trillion pictures are taken every year with smartphones? It's an incredible amount. And what that's doing, we don't quite know yet. So how does that change the way we experience events? How does that change our memory when we have so much access to go back and look at things we've done in the past? There's many unexplored questions about how taking pictures, and of course pictures have so much information in them, more so than just remembering a sentence. And so researchers have begun interested in testing this as well. The first study to look at this was done by Linda Hankel. And what she did is she had subjects go on an art museum tour. They went to the art museum and they walked around, they looked at paintings and sculptures and pottery tools, and they were instructed, okay, these 15 objects I want you to photograph, these 15 objects I want you to simply observe. Don't photograph them. And then later on they were given a test, and what she found is that photographed objects were recalled less well than observed objects. So as you can see here, the camera condition, people remembered significantly less information than they did in the observed condition. This is now referred to as the photo-taking impairment effect, that we don't remember the things that we're photographing. And the argument is cognitive offloading. This is the argument that was made speculatively then, that because the camera is remembering it, you don't need to remember it yourself. You can just let those experiences happen because you think you're going to be able to look at it later. A big problem in that argument, of course, is that 95% of the pictures we take we never look at and get deleted by my kids before I get to look at them when they steal my phone. But nevertheless, that is the idea here. Now,
Ben, have you thought about,
yeah.
I'm just introspecting, a lot of times taking a picture, you're sort of looking at the framing and all these other things, and it isn't necessarily that the input to your brain, if you want to think about what you've got to be asked to recall, isn't the same. Whereas without the picture, you're really looking at what it is you're trying to remember. So these input differences rather than something about retrieval differences.
I think that's a great point. And that's probably part of it. That's probably part of the story. One thing we've done, so we've replicated this a number of times, and one thing we've done is we've even had people observe a painting, for example, for the exact same amount of time, 10 seconds, but then one group, after those 10 seconds, have to take a picture in addition to looking for 10 seconds, they also don't remember as well as people that looked for 10 seconds. So even knowing that you're going to take a picture seems to stop you from encoding an experience. I've also stopped trying to video record all of my kids' recitals and whatnot, and all the parents think we're awful people for not doing it. But I'm in that moment. I'm experiencing it, which we'll come back to later.
What if the group didn't know that they were going to be able to take a picture? So there was no forethought. Just had two groups.
Well, then they would be
For
this.
15 seconds, and then one group you told them, okay, you can take a picture.
Oh, then they would be the same, and probably there would be a benefit maybe because then you would have a varied encoding opportunity. We've never done that specifically, and it's really hard to do those one trial experiments, right? You can't do that again. We'd need like 1,000 subjects, but it's an interesting idea. So what we did is I'll just give you a couple of the studies that we've done following up on this. One is just what is the mechanism? We thought this cognitive offloading idea was interesting, but not all interactions with technology need to be cognitive offloading. Sometimes using a camera just changes, like you said, the way you encode an event. Maybe it's just disrupting typical experience in a way that changes memory, and it's not that we're adaptively offloading memory to these devices. And so the other possibility we wanted to explore, another possibility we thought was possible, was attentional disengagement. So maybe when you're taking out your camera, you're just not attending to the world. You're out of the moment. You're now focused on aligning the camera and taking that picture, but you're not experiencing it the same way. The way it works, what we did is that we tested the offloading account by manipulating things that should affect whether you get this impairment effect or not. So we manipulated expectations about what photo taking would do, whether it actually would save or not save the information being photographed. If the impairment is due to cognitive offloading, then it should only be observed when participants expect photos to be saved. And I was not aware of this app at the time, but my grad student was. This Snapchat, which now most of us know about. Snapchat's famous feature is that you take a photo and you send it, and it's ephemeral. So the photo is viewed and then it disappears, and it's not saved to your phone. And so when people take photos via Snapchat, it's with an expectation that it's not going to be available in the future. So we thought we would take that feature and make it part of our manipulation, because if a person's taking photos via Snapchat, it's not offloading anymore. Rather, it's taking a picture, and they should assume that they're not going to have access to it anymore, and so you shouldn't see forgetting. What we did is we didn't want to go, we probably should have done a real museum tour, but that sounded like a lot more work for my grad student, and so what she did is create a simulated museum tour via computer where they looked at various paintings, and there were 3 conditions. Either you took photos with a camera, and this is still the smartphone. I'll call it a camera, but it's a smartphone. And you save them, and they were told you'll have access to these photos later on. Or we're going to have you take it via Snapchat, and they were told you would not have access to them. So it was emphasized that was the case. Or they were simply asked to observe the paintings and not asked to take any photos. In some experiments, we control for the amount of time. In some experiments, we increase the amount of time they have observed to match up with the other 2 conditions. I'll just tell you that the same pattern of results is observed either way. So this isn't a total amount of time phenomenon. Then after a 10-minute delay, they're given a visual detail test. And the way this typically looks is we'll give multiple choice questions, such as in which of the following accompanies the woman in the poppy field by Claude Monet. And they would have to remember some detail from the painting without the painting being there. These are not designed to be easy questions, so they really are testing how much of the visual details people are able to remember. Here are the results of this first experiment. We replicated the photo-taking impairment effect, so substantially better memory in the observed condition. Now remember, the cognitive offloading account would have predicted that the Snapchat condition should be up here. If you didn't save it, and if it's offloading, you should have continued to remember or encode that information. If anything, it actually got worse. Now, I don't know if that's real. This might have to do with the use of Snapchat and perhaps features of what that did to taking the photo. But nevertheless, this clearly does not seem to be consistent with the offloading account. In one of the follow-ups, we replaced the Snapchat condition with a delete condition. So we had them take photos in the camera condition, but we told them then, all right, that was a great picture, delete it. This emphasized that they would not have access to that photo, that it wasn't being saved, and it should bring performance back up here. It didn't. So we replicated the photo-taking impairment effect, and it didn't matter whether you saved or deleted the photo, which is once again very problematic for this offloading account.
Isn't it possible in this situation, I have a granddaughter, Snapchat, all the time.
Yeah.
That you do this with the expectation that this is not important, it's not worth saving, and so you're not programming your mind to try to...
Yeah, that's a great point. The one problem, though, is when we ask participants, what do you think you're going to remember? They actually are more confident in the memory they take via Snapchat. So they think they're going to better remember it, even though it's worse. And I'll give you a little bit of that data in a minute. All right, so here's a follow-up that we are currently, that we just submitted. I'll give you a little bit of it. In one condition, we also wanted to look at volition. This is also a question we get often is, okay, you're telling people what to take photographs of, but people don't do that. People typically choose. And so maybe if they could volitionally take photos, that this impairment effect would go away because they could sort of pick and choose what they should be taking pictures of. So we included that condition. And we also wanted to measure participants' expectations. According to the offloading account, they should expect photo taking to impair memory because they know that they're not encoding it as well. And that's why it's a form of offloading. And so we had 128 participants in 2 different conditions. Half the participants were in a volitional conditions where they got to decide. They had 20 paintings and they were told, you can take as many pictures as you want of whatever paintings you want. It's up to you. And we compared that to a condition that was non-volitional. So for each volitional participant, there was a yoked participant here who had to take pictures of the exact same pictures that these participants up here took. That matched the particular pictures, but only manipulated whether they were volitional or non-volitional. Finally, participants were also asked to predict memory performance before taking the test. They were asked to predict the percentage of photographed paintings you expect to remember and the percentage of the non-photographed paintings that you expected to remember. Here are the results. We controlled for a lot of things here. This is why the effect's a little bit smaller, but once again, we replicate the photo-taking impairment effect. And importantly, you get it for the volitional condition and for the non-volitional condition. So that doesn't seem to be an important feature. But here's the alarming part that comes back to the point over here. When you got to choose what you took photos of, you thought you were going to remember the photographed items substantially better than the non-photographed items, despite actual recall going in the opposite direction. These are the exact same items. So what it's showing is that there's a metacognitive illusion where people think taking a photo is going to imprint that memory into them and allow them to remember when it's having the opposite effect. For whatever reason, the non-volitional condition, it didn't come out there, but it does come out in other versions of this task. So it's, once again, doesn't fit with the cognitive offloading account, and it also tells gives an interesting perspective of at least what undergrads, these are undergrads participants, might be thinking when they are engaged in photography. So photo taking impairment doesn't seem to be caused by offloading. It's just a summary. It occurs when people don't expect them to be saved, and it occurs even though people expect photo taking to enhance memory. the way I like to think about it is there's no question you could use a camera to offload. The point is that we don't as much as we think we do, and that more importantly, that the impairment effect is not being caused by that. So there's instances in which we do offload. You know, if you want to remember where you parked your car, for example, that was a question earlier, take a photo of it, then you don't have to remember it. That is very useful. And my guess is you would get an impairment effect perhaps there because of that, but no one's ever done that study, so we'll see. What is the mechanism? We don't have a lot of positive evidence for the attentional disengagement account, but it is our sort of best guess at this point that participants just seem to disengage from the moment, that they don't process information the same way when they're using a camera. And I also like this other idea that was also said earlier, that how an experience is encoded may be altered or disruptive. And it's possible that certain aspects of an experience are enhanced by taking a photo, whereas other ones are impaired. And so that a lot of that work still needs to be figured out. How am I doing on time?
You've got about 5-10 minutes.
Okay. Trivia question. We just had the chancellor here. This is not the chancellor. Who was the president of the UC in the year 2000? Anyone remember? All right. So what I was interested in here, it's a memory researcher, if that helps.
It's a what?
Richard Atkinson. He was a memory researcher. Now, what we were interested in is when people are presented with questions that they don't know the answer, how quickly and under what conditions do you actually search for the answer online? So in this line of work, we were trying to figure out how do we interact with the internet? When do we choose to do that? And what are the factors that push that around? So, and the idea was that maybe we are becoming fixated on the internet for accessing information and suffering what can be referred to as a sort of Einfhrung effect, where you get used to solving a problem in a certain way, you continue to try to solve it in that same way, even when it's no longer useful. So do we become stuck on using the internet to access information, even when we could rely on our own minds? So that's what we studied here. Jump to the method. We had 3 conditions. Some participants were given 8 difficult trivia questions, like the ones I told you before. They weren't that difficult. But 100% of the time, these participants were asked to look for the information online. In the memory condition, they were asked to try to answer from memory. You're not allowed to look online. No mention was made of the internet. And another third of the participants were just not given any questions at all. They just were asked to go on to the phase 2. The question was, having searched for answers to difficult questions in this phase, would that increase the likelihood that you answer questions by searching the internet in phase 2, with now being really easy questions? It's things like, what is the eye of a hurricane called? In what sport is there a foil? How many events in a decathlon? And these were piloted. These were piloted so that most undergrads would know the answer at about 80%. So the question was, would you still use Google to answer these rather than just respond verbally? And yes, you do. As a sort of baseline, 65% of the time people used Google anyway. Memory didn't really affect that much, but the internet condition, you went up about 20%. So now you were, even for these questions that you knew the answer to, you're becoming more reliant on the internet to answering them. And you can't see these here, but these are giant effects. These are Cohen's d of about 1.0 and above. So they're really affecting the way people are interacting with technology. In experiment 2, we pushed this a little bit more. We included the internet and memory condition again, but we also set up the lab so that subjects sat on a sofa across the room. It was a very comfortable sofa, and they had the option of just answering from there, or they had to stand up in front of the researcher, walk over to a computer on the other side of the lab, and conduct their search. And we even made it really bad for some participants. They had to walk up and go use a first-generation iPod that was really clunky and awful. And we wanted to know, would people still use the internet even under these circumstances for these easy questions? So here's just the same graphs I showed you before. This is for the sofa then computer. This is for sofa then old iPod. And the answer is yes. It's a tiny bit smaller of an effect, but still highly reliable. You're more likely to rely on the internet with those easy questions if you had done so in the first phase, and the same thing with the iPod over here. So we do seem to become fixated on relying on Google. Now, you do see a decrease. These numbers are lower. But overall, once you get used to using it, you're continuing to want to use it into the future. And the other sort of nuanced point here, which some of you might be thinking, maybe this is good, right? Would the undergrads been able to answer? Maybe they don't know what the center of a hurricane is called. You were right to be concerned. Here is performance rate when answering the question. So when people were reliant on Google, they got 90% right. When they weren't, they got 74% right. So that's, if you just were interested in absolute performance levels and you didn't care how people got at it, whether they interacted with the computer or not, this is better, right? Maybe we do want people to interact with the computer. One thing we're studying now, though, is what's the consequences of these events. And so, yes, you get this right, but do you learn? And would these individuals actually remember this information better than those individuals down the line is an important question to ask.
Why isn't it 100%? To get the right answer.
Why? Because they still answered incorrectly. They thought they knew the answer and didn't rely on the internet, probably. So 34% of the time they answered from memory. And they said, oh, a decathlon? Yeah, that's 15, right? One more experiment here. We wanted to know what it means to be fixated on Google, and so we added 2 DVs. We wanted to know whether you actually didn't bother to search yourself and whether it decreased something called need for cognition. Need for cognition means you enjoy things like learning about science during lunch as opposed to doing other things. What we did is we had their internet memory conditions. We replicated the likelihood of Google search in phase 2, just like we did before. But then we also looked at the time before they searched. So when they did do a Google search, how quickly did they make the decision to go ahead and rely on Google as opposed to try to think of the answer themselves? In the internet condition, they waited 2 seconds, 2.22 seconds before hitting the keyboard. At least in the memory condition, they waited 3.76 seconds. So that's about 1.5 seconds of cognition, which is meaningful, actually. And also, this was the most alarming thing. Need for cognition is supposed to be a stable trait measure. It's not supposed to be something that moves around as a consequence of doing a 10-minute task, and yet it did. Substantially lower need for cognition scores were reported by participants who had experienced the internet.
What is need for cognition?
Need for cognition is your enjoyment in doing cognitively difficult tasks. So people just stopped enjoying challenging themselves after learning to become reliant on the internet, despite getting more answers right here.
If you broke down instead of an overall average, if you broke down the time before search and the success in getting an answer, is there a relation between how much time they take before they do the search and how successful they are with coming up with it?
The fact that I don't remember the answer to that tells me that there probably wasn't an interesting correlation. But that's an inference. I don't know. I could have forgot to do that. But that sounds like a really cool idea to look at. I'm going to have to look at that again. Last thing I'll talk about, there's also work published in other labs showing that Google makes you think you're smarter than you are, and so it leads to this metacognitive illusion. This is one classic study where they had people answer questions like, why do we have leap years? And they either had to try to answer from memory or they had to answer by doing a Google search and then explaining in detail. Then after that, they did this a number of times, they were given new questions, and they were simply asked, all right, how well could you answer in detail the following questions about the weather? Such as, why are there more Atlantic hurricanes in August and September? How do tornadoes form? Why are cloudy nights warmer? Not easy questions, but questions you really have to think critically about. And what they found is that participants who had answered questions previously using Google were systematically overconfident in their ability to answer new questions compared to participants who didn't answer via Google. So the more we access knowledge, we tend to inflate the amount of information we think we know inside our head. And one related finding we found in our lab, I don't have a slide on this, is that the quicker you find information online, also the more confident you think you're going to be able to remember that information later on, even though it's the exact opposite. The quicker you find something online, the less likely you're going to remember it. And just related to this, since we're in the Arboretum, they've done studies like this with middle school students. Have you ever heard of the tree octopus? There's no such thing as a tree octopus. Yet if you give people a report and you create a website and you assign it, you say, do a report on the tree octopus, 95% of middle schoolers will come back with a report from an internet website they find and not be able to tell truth from reality. In fairness, there are some weird animals in the world, so I mean, I'm not as impressed by this as others. But there are arguments that digital natives, people who have grown up with the internet, that rely on it, compared to digital immigrants, people who have acquired it later in life, are fundamentally different, that their cognition is different. And so here's some of the things that have been argued, that you have this rapid attention shifting, you're not deliberate, you're encoding information more shallowly, you're multitasking. One thing we know from cognitive perspective is that people think they're good at multitasking, they're not. They're almost always impairments. You're distracted. You have poor executive control abilities, dealing with emotion and anxiety in particular, internet addictive behaviors, and regulating emotion. All of these things have been argued, and there's some evidence to support the idea that our interactions with technology are having these consequences for us. So a couple concluding comments. Research really needs to explore the ways in which the internet and other technologies affect the way we think, remember. This is just like I said, this is the beginning. I'd love to hear your ideas on other questions we could ask. And also, the costs and benefits remain largely unknown. I don't have the answer. Is it better? I don't know. Learning expertise, creativity, autobiographical memory, there's so many ways in which we could measure how things are changing. I would argue that overall the advantages are probably going to outweigh the disadvantage when you actually look at the function of what is being accomplished, or maybe at least when aggregated across individuals. But there's so many levels of analysis here that it hurts to think about. And ultimately, technologies like the internet are just tools, and it's up to us to design them in a way that effectively expands rather than constrains the abilities of the mind. And I think that's something that we want to remember. Okay. Thank you.
We got time for a couple of questions. Eli?
Well, up until last week, I agree with everything you said about photography and memory. Last week, I was at a meeting in San Diego. And right after the meeting, we went out to look at the sunset. And the sun was just going down, and I pulled out my iPhone, take a picture, and actually someone came up to me and said, "Don't take a picture, just enjoy it." And so I took a set of pictures. We were looking for the green flash, if you know what that is.
Yeah, I do.
Nobody indicated they saw it, but because the iPhones actually take a short video every time you click it, I looked at that video. In the middle of that, actually saw a beautiful green flash.
No kidding.
Nobody recognized seeing, I didn't recognize seeing it, but the phone call.
There's things you can't do without it. Yeah.
That technology is good for something.
Yeah. And you probably wouldn't be telling that story now if you didn't have the camera. Yeah. And it may be like with these tasks, they're going around taking pictures of dozens of things. But when there's one event, does that increase the salience and importance of it in meaningful ways? That might be an interesting follow-up, is maybe this impairment effect gets reversed when it's just one thing you're taking a picture of. Yeah.
Just a comment about doing two things at once. I just recently learned that study of balance. So a person stands, an elderly person stands on like an electronic scale, and it measures where the center of gravity is and plots it as it moves around. And then the second experiment, they did the same thing, but they had to count backwards from 900. And the pattern of the movement of the center of gravity was much larger when they were multitasking than when they were focused on just balancing and nothing else.
Yeah, and you would think counting backwards would have nothing to do with maintaining balance. That those are really separate neural pathways involved.
It's not
but
taking your eyes off of the horizon either, so you still have the same.
That reminds me of another famous experiment done by Wegner, though, where he had someone do something similar, but tell them don't move to the left, to the right, and they start swaying to the left and right. They call it ironic errors.
Second question on a different topic. Have you ever allowed the people that took a picture to later just review their pictures before the second part of the experiment?
Yeah, we have not in this line of work because we're more interested in the consequences of taking the photo itself. That is a whole nother literature of what is the consequence of photographic review. And that's also an interesting question that as someone who studies retrieval, and whenever you see a photo, you engage in retrieval. And how does that modify your memory of the event is a really important question that we're planning to study, yeah.
Okay, last question, Bill.
Me? See if I can remember it. I was curious about the relationship of this kind of offloading activity and that word that I can't remember, aphasia.
Oh. So there's different types of aphasia.
Well, I have aphasia where I can't remember things.
Yeah.
Just a single word, and it'll come to me 10 minutes later. And I just am curious about the basis of that.
Yeah, that's a little bit out of my area of expertise, but I experienced that a lot too. The lack of, my whole life though, I guess it's going to get worse, right? So, yeah, and how could you design an offloading system to really get around that? Is that kind of what you're getting at, or?
You could just test all of us in the room, and those who use the computer and those who don't.
Oh, I see. So the argument is does that exacerbate it to an extent? I don't know. I haven't seen anyone look at that yet. I'll have to think about it.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
All right.
See you all in March.